A very warm welcome to our presenters, to our viewers in this, the Universal Peace Federation Australia's webinar on the theme, Peace and Reunification of the Korean Peninsula, Transcending the Present and Building the Future. My name's Greg Stone. I'm the Secretary General of UPF in Oceania. It's my very great privilege to be the moderator for the webinar today. And we have a particularly fine panel of speakers to address this topic. They are Mr. John Adamides, the President of Universal Peace Federation in Australia, Reverend John Brownbill, the Chaplain of the Korean Veterans Association of Australia, who will present via video, Dr. Lauren Richardson, Lecturer of the Department of International Relations and Director of ANU Japan Institute, and Mr. Mike Breen, Seoul-based journalist, consultant, and author. I'll be introducing each of them in more detail as I invite them up to speak. But first off, we're going to view an introductory video giving more background about the host organization today, the Universal Peace Federation. Let's view the video.
UPF had its inaugural assembly on September 12, 2005 at the Lincoln Center in New York City. Reverend Sun Myung Moon delivered the keynote address.
In closing, I ask you to devote your best efforts for the development and the success of the Universal Peace Federation. Thank you. Thank you.
After UPF was founded, there was a series of world tours where the message of UPF was taken literally to every corner of the world.
That it is time for all nations and religions to break down their barriers. Through this, the era of one family under God will arrive and last forever.
UPF is God's cherished hope. The founders spoke repeatedly of an international peace highway connecting the world from Santiago, Chile to London, across the Bering Strait, what has come to be known as the Peace Road, and a vision for a renewed United Nations. UPF emerged on the foundation of decades of programs initiated by its founders and carried out in all parts of the world. Its growth and development over the past 15 years has been dramatic, if not miraculous, owing in large part to the work of tens of thousands of ambassadors for peace, peace activists, and volunteers who draw from all nationalities, religions, ethnicities, cultures, and traditions, bound together by a vision of peace, a vision of humanity as one global family under one God. The range of programs over the years has been both broad and expansive, from character education to strengthening the family, from conflict prevention to conflict resolution, from poverty reduction to environmental stewardship, from interfaith dialogue to youth service initiatives, from support of the United Nations to partnerships with the African Union, and a wide range of international organizations and NGOs. UPF has a global, multinational, multi-faith network of more than 100,000 ambassadors for peace who support and contribute to the mission and works of UPF. UPF's highest award, the Leadership and Good Governance Award, has been given to distinguished leaders the world over. The World Summit Series is UPF's flagship program involving the highest level of leaders from around the globe, including current and former heads of state and government, to address the critical challenges facing humanity.
Very appropriate that we're here on the 100th anniversary of Reverend Moon's birth, because out of the devastation of World War II and the Korean War, he and his bride found the courage to dream that they could achieve something. And it is amazing what they have created together.
Programs have been successfully held in Korea, the USA, Senegal, South Africa, Nepal, Cambodia, and other nations. The most recent structural innovation within UPF has been the creation of a set of associations dedicated to collaboration among leaders from various fields. These pillar associations are: the International Summit Council for Peace was initiated by UPF co-founder Dr. Hak Jahan Moon in 2019 on the occasion of World Summit 2019 in Seoul, Korea. ISCP is an international network of current and former heads of state and government. The International Association of First Ladies, IAFLP, a project of the ISCP, affirms and uplifts the unique role of First Ladies in contributing to peace and development. IAFLP brings together current and former First Ladies from throughout the world, drawing upon their experience and wisdom as women leaders and as role models who serve their countries in significant ways. The International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace, IAPP, is a worldwide association of parliamentarians which provides a forum to bring their experience and wisdom to bear in the search for solutions to our world's problems. UPF maintains that any successful strategy for peace must take into account the spiritual dimension of our human identity, experience, and interactions. Based on this worldview, UPF initiated the Interreligious Association for Peace and Development, IAPD. The International Media Association for Peace, IMAP, represents a worldwide professional network of journalists who support a socially responsible and moral media. IMAP recognizes the vital role that journalists play in providing objective reporting to foster an informed citizenship. The International Association of Academicians for Peace, IAAP, is a global interdisciplinary academic initiative aimed at contributing toward the realization of a world of lasting peace. IAAP is dedicated to building professional networks for academicians to foster a world of peace. The International Association for Peace and Economic Development, IAED, affirms the role of businesses, business leaders, and investors to make the world a better place. In early 2020, UPF convened a rally of hope featuring dignitaries including Pastor Paula White, Cambodia Head of State His Excellency Hun Sen, President Macky Sall of Senegal, former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, former US Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and many others.
I believe that the Universal Peace Federation and its broad set of partnerships in the realms of politics, religion, academia, media, economy, arts, women and youth serve as a good model. I believe the Universal Peace Federation will become a cornerstone to build lasting peace around the world and the heavenly unified Korea based on interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values.
Celebrating 15 years, UPF will continue to grow through service, dialogue, and collaboration, guided by its spiritual and moral vision of one family under God.
Thank you so much for that very informative video. As mentioned, the theme of our webinar today is Peace and Unification of the Korean Peninsula, Transcending the Present and Building the Future. The Korean War, it began in 1950, and now just over 70 years have gone by. 3 years after the beginning of the war, nearly 5 million people were dead. More than half of them were civilians. The war concluded not with a peace treaty, but with an uneasy armistice, leaving the once unified Korean Peninsula divided, despite being populated by a people with a common history, culture, and language. The founders of the Universal Peace Federation, Reverend Sun Myung Moon and Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, were both born in what is now North Korea. They directly experienced, both of them, the destitution as refugees of the war. They've known only too well the ravages of war and its aftermath. And this is no doubt a contributing factor which has greatly influenced their life and all their lifelong efforts to work for peace and the peaceful reunification of their homeland. And indeed, it has stimulated their worldwide efforts for peace all over the world. Now, this webinar has brought together experts from academia, from journalism, from religion, including even a Korean War veteran, to examine the prospects for the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula today. It's going to be very interesting to hear from each of them. They will present for up to 15 minutes, offering their insights and their reflections on the topic. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists in turn. Following their presentation, there will be some time, hopefully, for question and answers to the panelists. Viewers, please send your questions via the chat. So now our first speaker is Mr. John Adamides. John was born in Australia from Greek migrants, actually, but he became a member of the unification movement when he was traveling in Britain in 1980. And he spent 4 years there working as a youth volunteer and also as a presenter. He later transferred to the United States, where he participated in community outreach, and later he became the city leader of Family Federation for World Peace and Unification in Tampa, Florida. In 1989, he returned back to Brisbane and he became a tertiary and further education teacher, specializing in information technology. He later took more time off and he volunteered to go to the Solomon Islands between 2004 and 2008, where he worked for the Family Federation for World Peace and for the Universal Peace Federation there. John returned to teaching in IT in Australia, and he was later appointed more recently in 2019 as the National Director of Family Federation for World Peace and Unification and Universal Peace Federation in Australia. These are two positions he currently holds. So join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to John Adamides.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to the participants. I'll just share the screen. I have a presentation, and just bear with me, I'll just bring it up. So you can see the screen okay, yes. All right, so thank you everyone. As you can see, the peace and reunification of the Korean Peninsula, transcending the present and building the future is the topic that we have today. And I just want to outline what I plan to go through. Talk a little bit about Universal Peace Federation, the UPF founders, Australia's involvement, and what this transcending the present means and building the future. So I'll go through it. I hope you enjoy the experience. All right, so the Universal Peace Federation is a global network of individuals and organisations dedicated to building world peace, in which everyone can live in freedom, harmony, cooperation and prosperity. Peace is not simply the absence of war or a term that applies only to nations. So far, the traditional approaches to world peace, such as political and military action, economic sanctions and diplomacy, have not brought the peace results we desire. UPF is providing visionary, action-oriented leadership in promoting innovative approaches to peace. These approaches include interreligious dialogue and action, focus on the traditional three-generational family, education, character education and service. Peace is an essential quality that should characterize all relationships. So Universal Peace Federation has core principles of peace, which I'll just quickly outline. One being God. We are one human family created by God. The way to rise above the pursuit of self-interest is to recognize our common humanity given to us by our Creator. Second is spirituality. The highest qualities of the human being are spiritual and moral in nature. Human beings long for truth, beauty, and goodness. Third, the family. The family is the school of love and peace. It's in the family that the most basic personal and public virtues are learned. Service, living for the sake of others, is the way to reconcile the divided human family. By practicing living for the sake of others, we become other-centered rather than self-centered. And unity. Peace comes through cooperation beyond the boundaries of ethnicity, religion, and nationality. Lasting peace cannot be achieved through political compromise alone, but requires addressing the root causes of conflict. Transcending racial, religious, and ethnic barriers is an imperative of our time. Faith can give people the power to forgive and to love, and the love to overcome even generations of hatred, resentment, and violence. So about our founders, as Greg Stone mentioned, the founders, Dr. Sun Myung Moon, he was born in 1920 and passed in 2012. Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, they share many things. They both founded the Universal Peace Federation. They both were born in what is now North Korea, and they both share the same birthday, 6th of January. They both suffered under the North Korean communists. In fact, Dr. Sun Myung Moon miraculously survived 2 years and 8 months in Hungnam labor camp, where most died after 6 months. But most importantly, they both share the same passion for peace. And I'd like to share a small video that goes for 3 minutes that helps portray that feeling that they both shared during that time.
Peace in those days was at best a dream. Communism was on the rise, and as a devout Christian family, we knew we needed to escape south. The distance between my hometown and the 38th parallel was over 200 kilometers. Heading south was not only forbidden, it was almost impossible. There were no good roads, and they plowed the rice fields in a way that was impassable. You couldn't travel by day, and because of the night police, it was dangerous to go at night. Finally, the 38th parallel came into view. I remember it so vividly. I saw a young woman run across the border as if she was escaping death. But our family could not run like that because I was only 6 years old and we were exhausted. By then, I had caught a cold and desperately needed water. So my grandmother went to fetch some from the locals. The police were everywhere, and as I was drinking, they found us. Because we were just women, they did not expect us to defy them. The officer told us, "Go back to your hometown." But after walking 200 kilometers, there was no turning back. So, at the risk of our lives, that very night, we crossed the border. It feels just like yesterday. The time I met my husband, I knew he was an incredible man. He carried the burdens of the world on his shoulders.
Since my encounter with Jesus, I lived my life with just one thought. I wanted to bring about a world of peace, a world where there are no wars and where all humankind lives in love.
You were given an incredible cross to bear to fulfill our mission from God. The road to peace has been so hard, it felt virtually impossible to reach our goal. But this is how we lived, day and night. It's my husband's passing. Our dream to serve God lives on. I can see the finish line within reach. Just like the police that tried to stop me from crossing the border, some may say that it is not possible. I am absolutely determined to bring about a world of peace within my lifetime.
So that gives a feeling of the emotions that were at that time. So now I'll just move on to Australia's involvement in the Korean War. That began with Japan's defeat in World War II. The surrender of Japan to the Allied forces on the 2nd of September 1945 led to the peninsula being subsequently divided into North and South Korea. The North being occupied by Soviet Union troops and officially called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the South, below the 38th parallel, being occupied by the United States troops and officially called the Republic of Korea. So that's the situation. Because of the end of the Second World War, Korea was divided in a deal between the nations. So it may be surprising to most that Australia has supported the reunification of Korea well before the Korean War began. 3 years before the war broke out, United Nations Commission on Korea was created to assist in the unification of Korea. 9 countries were involved, Australia was one of them. Their mission mandate to assist in the unification of Korea and the removal of barriers caused by the division of Korea and to observe the withdrawal of occupying forces. As that became hard, then it was expanded to include observing and reporting on any developments that might lead to military conflict. And this is when 2 Australian military observers who first reported the North Korean invasion of the South on the 25th of June 1950. So I'd like to share this small video, 70 years since war broke out between North and South, that names these 2 military people, and actually because of them, the war took place and South Korea was able to be saved. Otherwise, the entire nation would have been different. So
a salute to his younger self through events that still loom larger than life.
I had somebody say that I still look the same.
Australian-born Rear Admiral Ian Crawford was just 18 when he was thrust into battle on a British naval ship soon after war broke out on the Korean Peninsula.
At that age, we were all very much inspired by our fathers and uncles. We were very anxious to be seen to be doing our bit.
In the weary years after World War II, and with communism's dominoes starting to fall in North Asia, the 25th of June 1950 pitched the might of the US and its allies into a brutal conflict to halt Kim Il-sung's advancing forces from the north. From the very beginning, 2 unsung Australians, Stuart Peach and Ronald Rankin, had played a pivotal role in mobilising the world's response.
The flag behind us here as well is the one that they flew in their vehicle.
The pair had patrolled the border of the 38th parallel for a fortnight, concluding that the North was ready for war and the South hopelessly outgunned.
Peach Rankin report actually showed that the North Koreans were the aggressors.
Within a day, the United Nations was convinced. War had broken out and the North was on the rampage into Seoul. Australia would commit 17,000 forces, stood up in a hurry. Some, including the K-Force of Army volunteers, were recruited in a day, and Air Force jets being packed up in Japan to come home suddenly redirected for long, cold sorties over the peninsula.
Some of the pilots actually recorded not being able to feel the pedals with their rudder pedals when they were flying their aircraft because their feet had turned to ice.
Across the war, up to 4 million lives were lost, both sides advancing and retreating until, exhausted,
we have stopped the shooting.
They called a ceasefire after 3 years, 1 month and 2 days of battles that veterans lament haven't been paid the attention they deserve.
And some people used to say, what, you call that a war? So we felt that we were overlooked. But now we feel that there's more recognition.
The passage of 7 decades isn't simply a commemoration of the 340 Australian lives lost in the war. It's also a reminder that on a peninsula that remains heavily armed and bubbling with tensions, current and future generations of Australian forces could end up going back there to fight if that fragile armistice ever breaks down. It's threatened to, time and again in the last 67 years, through endless brinkmanship, nuclear programs, weapons development and provocation. The promise of a border meeting and 2 summits with a US president landed nothing other than publicity and ever-present risks for all concerned.
And we need to replace this armistice status to the more permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula.
If a war or a conflict does break out again on the Korean Peninsula, we are obligated to go to the aid of the South Koreans once again.
70 million lives in the divided Koreas and more beyond depend on that truce holding. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Canberra.
Thank you. And we still have 43 servicemen missing in action, a large number in the DMZ, which is now, excuse me, which is now full of landmines. We hope we finally might be able to identify some of the missing. According to the Australian War Memorial historian Michael Kelly, honouring Australian veterans is long overdue, especially as most are getting older. We owe a big thanks to our vets. They helped save South Korea, Mr. Kelly said. 22 nations committed troops to help South Korea. They're never forgotten that and honour our vets more than we do, and that's embarrassing, he said. Now to look at transcending the present. You know, the division is clearly visible from space by the amount of light being emitted, and you can see that by that shot from space. And we see that this is the current situation, the North and South, and what we want to see is a united Korea, you know, one. And we believe that the core principles of peace that UPF promote can witness the reunification in North and South Korea. So UPF and Dr. Moon's philosophy of living for others was put in practice by a meeting with Kim Il-sung in 1991, which opened the door to various initiatives. And these initiatives involved family reunions, the opening of Kumgan Mountain to tourists, the Ponghwa Motors, which was given by UPF founders, their father and mother Moon. They gave a car company that has exclusive rights. And yes, even North Korea has its own luxury brand. And another thing that they did was to promote culture and to bridge the gap between the two Koreas by having the Little Angels, which is a performing troupe, which was a troupe that visited here in Australia 10 years ago, and also in the one of the Rallies of Hope gave a special performance. And I'd like to just show a small 2.5-minute clip.
In 1950, you came to help our country of Korea. Today, we have come to give you a big thank you. I hope you like our show.
Yes, and also some of the things that Australia has done during this time was actually during the 2000 Summer Olympics, the two Koreas were under one flag. In Australia, as it says in this Associated Press release, divided for more than half a century by the Cold War, athletes from North and South Korea marched together behind one flag for the first time in the Olympics at the opening ceremony for the Sydney Games. The march brought the capacity crowd of 110,000 at Olympic Stadium to its feet and highlighted the International Olympic Committee's efforts to promote peace through sports. It was a good show of unity to the world, said Chung Un-sun, a star basketball player who served as the South Korean delegation's flag bearer, and the North flag bearer, Park Jung-chung, a judo coach. I was deeply moved, said Young Sung-bum, North Korea's chief delegate. I hope this mood will continue. Harmony and unity can be achieved, and the ideal of peace can be realized when we are motivated by genuine love to live for the benefit of others. And this is exemplified by the 45,000 plus volunteers who helped out with the Olympics, and also not to mention the 175,000 volunteer firefighters who risked their lives to fight bushfires, are models of people who selflessly live for others. This now brings me to the idea of, and concluding remarks to do with building the future. Harmony is needed for peace, and the thing that needs to be brought to the forefront is that we are one human family. We are the same. Reverend Moon once said that we are 99% the same. We live and breathe the same air. So building the future, harmony is needed for peace. Peace and harmony is needed for the family. The family is the natural and fundamental group of society. And it's the family where we learn our moral standards, our ethics, our values, our relationships, even how to express ourselves. The family and world peace. A quote from As a Peace-Loving Global Citizen, autobiography of Reverend Moon. The ideal is to bring about a world in which love is made real, and the family is the place where this love overflows. What makes us human? Marriage and family. The family is the only social institution in which all members of society consistently and fully participate. Also, the United Nations, in their Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 16, paragraph 3, the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. Another quote from Dr. Moon is the purpose of marriage. Marriage is more than a simple coming together of a man and woman. Through marriage, a new future is created. Societies are formed. Nations are built. God's world of peace is realized with married families at the center. And that concludes my presentation. And just to highlight that only when we act and live as a family, a global family, then we can really look after each other. So thank you, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, John Adamides. That was a very, very interesting and well-researched presentation. We really appreciate that, and especially giving us more insight into the role and interest of Australia in the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you so much also for giving us a bit of insight into the sort of track 2 diplomatic approach used by the founders of UPF. So now it's my time to introduce our next speaker. The next speaker is Reverend John Brown Bill. He's the chaplain of the Korean Veterans Association of Australia. Reverend Brown Bill is an ordained minister and chaplain to 31 different ex-service organisations in Australia, and he holds the decoration of Knight of Grace of the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem. During the Korean War, he was a young lieutenant with the Royal Australian Regiment, and he saw action in positions along the Samichon Valley. So we'll now see an interview with Reverend John Brownbill, conducted by Daniel Meadows, who's the director of UPF in Victoria, where Reverend Brownbill lives. So now we'll over to Daniel.
John Brownbill enlisted in the Army in Melbourne. He was selected for officer training and posted first to the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment in June 1952. He was sent to Japan, then in February 1953 was transferred to the 3rd Regiment, which was fighting in Korea. There he commanded an infantry platoon in action in the region of Hill 355, Samichon Valley and the Kansas line. Apart from the fighting and the fear, his lasting memory of his 12-month deployment is the raw beauty of the Korean countryside. He says, "When you are close to death, you notice beauty all around you, and the flora and fauna and mountains of Korea make it a beautiful place. Also, the weather and the mountains made for interesting fighting against a very methodical enemy." He says, "In the fog you couldn't see 6 inches. Then the breeze would come up and the fog would be gone, and you didn't want to be caught in the open." John Brownbill returned to Australia in March 1954, and in May transferred to the Citizen Military Forces, finally ending his army service in 1975. He first returned to Korea in the mid-1990s. "It was very moving," he says, "to stand looking out over Hill 355 at the demilitarized zone. You sort of go back a little bit in time. You go back and remember things that had happened there." John Brownbill's memories of the hours of tense patrolling have diluted and come to centre on the contrasts and extremes of the country. He recalls the frozen ground that broke pick handles, humidity that wrinkled hands like dishwater, and the dawn that reminds him of Kipling. The sun comes up like thunder. As well as remembering those who did not return, returning reinforces for him the connection between his war experiences, the country, and its people. "People come up to you," he says, "look you straight in the eye and say, 'If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here.' And that's pretty touching." Since becoming a chaplain at the age of 60, he has conducted many memorial services for those killed during the war and is constantly amazed by the gratitude of the Korean people. As someone who sacrificed and went to war for the safety of South Korea, how do you feel about the amazing development of South Korea, given that you risked your life to uphold their freedom?
Well, I've been back there 5 times, the first time in 1994. And I can only say that I've been absolutely amazed every time I went back. I cannot believe how they've achieved what they have done. If you fly over Seoul or Incheon, it makes flying over Melbourne look like you're in the outback. And they've done that in 60 years, 70 years. And when I was there was barely a tree because the Japanese had pinched them all, used the timber. And I think my 4th visit back, they'd had everybody available round planting trees, and they had them up the mountains and on top of buildings and everywhere. And I went back to take some children to Korea for the government and on to Gallipoli, and I was going to show them where the Battle of Kapyong had taken place. And I was going to say, well, look down there 2 miles and you'll see the approach. And you couldn't see more than 50 yards for trees. I had to draw maps for them. But on your question, I'd dearly love to see the place unified. But I have a theory which I've not heard anywhere else, and that is that I think it suits America and China to hold the place as a buffer state. If either party owned the whole place, the opposition could see it as a stepping stone for them to bounce over one way to Japan onto America, or the other way up to China and onto Russia. It would be wonderful if they could unify, but I have a feeling that that's what's stopping it. I've been up to the demilitarised zone and stood in the shed where they hold their conferences. I've been at the North Korean end of that and seen North Korean soldiers looking in the window, but I've never had the pleasure of talking to any of them.
When the Little Angels came to Melbourne, they were touring the 16 nations that fought in the Korean War. Were you able to see them?
I was in hospital at the time, but I heard wonderful reports of them. Everybody loved them.
Yeah. They recently, last year, it was the 70th anniversary, and they actually did a special performance for the veterans again. This time because of COVID, they could only do it from online. We're hoping to get a recording and send it to the KVA to view. So hopefully you can see them again. You're the chaplain of the Korean Veterans Association, and actually you've told us just now that you're the chaplain of quite a few things. What would you like to see in Australia that would ensure that the incredible sacrifice of the vets are remembered?
Well, the families are carrying on. The families of the deceased are carrying on, and that's my hope that that'll continue. And we're a fairly strong group still, but quite heavily diminished.
So, on being a chaplain, I know you've studied theology. What was your influence of faith in that role? Was it something that you felt you were guided to do? Or was it?
Oh yes, indeed. In fact, I was very heavily involved with the church before I went to Korea, but I couldn't equate killing with the church, so I let that lapse for quite a while.
You said you were hoping to go to Korea next year.
Yes, I'd been offered a trip back by my 6th trip back by the consulate last November, but the virus stopped that. But they've got me on the waiting list for this year if it's on. And I'd be delighted to go back. I just love the place and I love the people. I love everything they stand for. And, you know, kiddies can play in the streets at night. You can eat your food off the ground. I've always reckoned if somebody lost a cigarette paper and it was floating around, 10 people would try and grab it before it hit the ground. Even along the heavy highways, people stop off and plant flowers and so forth. Everything was no rough looking outback. Sheer beauty.
Wow. And the Korean consulate, I see they sent you, gift packages. Do you get quite a lot of support from them?
Well, they even sent us on 3 occasions different masks to use during this virus. I'll show them to you, man.
So yeah, they really show their gratitude then.
Oh yeah. Well, the amazing thing is, if I ring the consulate, either Melbourne or Canberra, and I say, "Is that Kate or is that?" And I mentioned a name. They say, "Yes, Mr. Brownbill." A chap Brownbill. They recognise my voice, probably because they're crackly.
The last question, we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but I'll ask again. What do you think? Do you think that it's possible that North and South Korea can unify?
I know South Korea plugging for it, but as I say, I think the big powers would like to keep it a pair of buffer states.
Okay.
That's my opinion, but I've not heard that expressed by anyone else.
No worries. Yeah.
I'd dearly love to see them unite.
Yeah.
And get a bit of common sense into the North.
Do you have any final words you'd like to say today?
I need to thank you very much for wasting your time to have a chat with me.
God bless you, John. Thank you so much.
どうもありがとうございます。
どういたしまして。
What about 감사합니다?
감사합니다. 네, 너무 감사합니다. Can you say one more time? Can you say 감사합니다 to the camera?
감사합니다.
Wow, wasn't that special? You know, something a little bit you probably wouldn't expect to see in a video about the reunification of North South Korea, but it gives a very beautiful kind of insight of the history and the feeling. It was called the Forgotten War, but it was a terrible war with so many casualties, so many people risked their lives, including Reverend Brownbill. And it's really great to honour and remember their sacrifice, and what has resulted from that is an amazing nation, now one of the leading nations in the world. So thank you so much, Reverend Brownbill, for that, and also for Daniel for being a very good interviewer. That was really good. Our next speaker is Dr. Lauren Richardson. She is lecturer in the Department of International Relations and director of the Australian National University Japan Institute. From 2018 to 2020, she was director of studies and lecturer in the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy at the ANU. Prior to her to that, Dr. Richardson taught Northeast Asian relations at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on the role of non-state actors in shaping diplomatic interactions in Northeast Asia, particularly Japan-Korea relations. Her publications have focused on the South Korean anti-nuclear movement, the role of Buddhists in Sino-Japanese rapprochement with G.A. Scott, Japan's evolving defense posture, and the ascension of comfort women in South Korean memory of Japanese imperialism. She's been a visiting fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs at Keio University, a recipient of the Prime Minister's Australia Asia Award 2011, and a participant of the US Korea Next Gen Scholars Program 2015 to 16, and the German Marshall Fund's Young Strategist Forum 2019. So let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Lauren Richardson.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, and big hello to our audience members today. I think this topic is extremely important, and it doesn't get enough discussion, frankly, especially in the Australian context. And just before I begin on the topic of the Korean War, I think it would be wonderful if Australia, who obviously played a key role in the Korean War, could also play a key role in bringing that war to an official end through helping the South Korean government perhaps negotiate a peace treaty with North Korea as a step towards the establishment of a peace regime and eventual reunification. So today I'm going to focus my topic on talking about non-state actors and the role that they might play in bringing peace between the two Koreas and ultimately reunification. And I think non-state actors are often a missing element in the discussions on the prospects for peace and reunification on the peninsula. We see in recent years, over the last decade, that attempts to deal with North Korea and, to promote peace, denuclearization, have been very state-centric. Okay, we've had a lot of summit meetings, very high-level summit meetings. We've also had the six-party talks before that. And these kind of arrangements really haven't brought about a great deal of change. Okay, so I think it's given the complexity of, the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, it's important that we really take a comprehensive view of how it might be achieved. And there's obviously strengths and weaknesses of non-state actors relative to the state, but it's important that we understand what their role is. So today I thought I'll just speak briefly about how non-state actors have, mostly in South Korea, but I'm also going to touch on non-state actors in Japan, what their role has been in the development of the North-South Korea relationship and what kind of lessons we can learn from that. I thought I'll touch on three areas. One is humanitarian assistance to North Korea. Another is another is environmental cooperation. And the third one is redress for colonial victims in North Korea. Okay, it's often forgotten. We see in the news on Japan and South Korea relations, what dominates that relationship today is the issues of former comfort women, the former forced laborers, and also to some extent the former atomic bomb victims in South Korea. And it's easy to forget that all of those categories of victim exist in the North as well, and nobody ever speaks about it. It's one of the really sad things about the division of the peninsula. So just on the humanitarian assistance topic, following a number of national sort of environmental or natural disasters, and also the downturn of the North Korean economy, in 1995, as I'm sure many of you know, the North Korean government really made quite an unprecedented appeal to the international community for humanitarian assistance. There was a very strong and enthusiastic response to this appeal from the non-state actor sector, including both international organizations and also the South Korea-based non-state actors. And these were mostly progressive NGOs and religious groups, which really took a lead in pressing for things like emergency aid. And this was at a time when the South Korean government was being quite cautious with North Korea. There were some tensions in the approach of the non-state actors in South Korea and more internationally. The international community kind of tends to view its work in this regard strictly within the paradigm of humanitarian crisis management or response. But the South Korean NGOs also viewed this as a good opportunity to pave a foundation for reunification and the promotion of friendlier ties. So how did their efforts serve this purpose? Basically by engaging North Korea with the provision of aid, non-state actors in South Korea have managed to build some level of trust between the North Korean government and the civil society sector in South Korea. And another important function of this, sometimes they've been criticized because people in South Korea have said, if we provide North Korea with too much assistance, humanitarian or otherwise, then the Kim regime or the Kim government is going to be able to focus more of its resources on developing nuclear weapons. But the fact is, by engaging North Korea in this way and providing various forms of humanitarian assistance, South Korean non-state actors have kind of served to mitigate some of the social and economic costs of reunification. as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's a lot of people in South Korea, especially the young generation, who have concerns about reunification. They're worried if we reunify, we're going to see a big downturn in our economy because North Korea is poorer and we're not. So by, providing this sort of humanitarian assistance and other forms of economic assistance as well, it's sort of serving to balance out some of the differences or between the two Koreas, and to ensure that the North Korean state is not going to collapse, which could cause quite a devastating form of reunification. And a second point, and this has been something in more recent years, and this has been also documented in a really great study by a scholar called Annie Young Song, that there's been quite a lot of noteworthy cooperation between South Korean environmental NGOs with North Korea in the forestry sector. So the kind of scope of cooperation in this regard has been things like afforestation, exchange of technology on forest seedlings, pest control, and also general discussion about shared environmental challenges. So her study found that, despite the ongoing tensions between the two governments, some South Korean NGOs have been really successful in kind of navigating those tensions and being able to initiate conferences and meetings on forestry involving academics and policy experts from both Koreas. And they even conducted a joint investigation into the spread of pests in pine trees in North Korea. So the third problem I want to mention is going back to the colonial victims. One thing that very few people seem to know about, and we just recently commemorated the anniversary of the atomic bombing of Japan just last year, that about 2,000 of the atomic bomb victims, the Korean atomic bomb victims, who were mostly in Japan working as forced laborers and other things, they were sent back to North Korea. And as a result of that, they didn't get any of the medical assistance or any of the financial assistance that all of the other atomic bomb victims around the world received. And this is something that came to the attention of some non-state actors in Japan, and the leader was a Korean activist by the name Lee Sil-gun. Sadly, he passed away last year, but he devoted his life to trying to send assistance to those victims. He arranged for Japanese doctors who were experts in treating atomic bomb-related illness to go to North Korea to teach North Korean doctors how to treat that particular illness, which really requires a lot of specialized treatment. He also brought some of the North Korean doctors to Japan to familiarize them with advanced medical equipment. So just to kind of bring all of this discussion together, obviously non-state actors don't really have the ability to decide how, tensions between North and South Korea are going to be resolved or sorted out, what the general policy approach is or foreign policy is going to look like. But they have played, I think in many ways, they show the way for engaging with North Korea. The reason that the North Korean government was willing to engage with all of these actors is that they were approaching North Korea on issues, the North Korean government on issues that were, part of the state interest in North Korea. Okay, North Korea has an interest in receiving redress for the colonial past. They have an interest in protecting their environment, in making sure, the population doesn't die from famine and other disasters. So I think we can learn from that, as long as we're not approaching North Korea with a completely hostile agenda. Some things are very sensitive, like denuclearization or addressing human rights abuses at the hands of the North Korean state, to start with these other agendas as a way of really building up trust. And what I found across all of these cases of non-state actors is often their efforts were impeded by tensions between the various governments. One of the saddest things about the atomic bomb victim case is that the Japanese government was finally reaching a point where it was ready to help the atomic bomb victims, to provide assistance to the ones in North Korea. But it changed its mind when the abduction issue really took off in 2002. Japanese government officials just dropped that issue overnight because they saw a tide of anti-North Korean sentiment emerge in Japan. And suddenly there was no room for reaching out to the victims there. So what we see from that case is what is lacking is a real universal conception of human rights, realizing that, Japanese abductee victims, it's an extremely important issue as well. But why does their human rights trump the rights of someone in North Korea, a victim in North Korea? I think it's a challenge for the states to really find a way to embrace, the concept that North Korean citizens also have human rights, and by addressing those issues, the human rights abuses committed at the hands of other governments, so the United States, Japan during colonialism, that they're also seen to. And another one of the sad facts about this issue is that the development of North Korea's nuclear weapons program was another reason why the Japanese government backed away from helping the atomic bomb victims there. So there's a lot of really sad ironies, but I think it's important that we promote non-state actor engagement with North Korea, because as we heard in the beginning of this seminar, governments change and their policy changes toward North Korea. Sometimes they want to isolate, sometimes they want to engage, and it's really back, one step forward, two steps back. But what we really need is a sustained kind of track to or non-state actor engagement, the sort of actors that are above the politics, that can transcend the politics between the countries in the region, and also that have more of a universal conception of human rights and recognize the importance of separating the North Korean government from the people who live in North Korea. So I think I'll finish my talk with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lauren Richardson, for that excellent overview of the importance and the role of non-state actors, and along with that, the track to diplomacy and how they can complement the work of the nation states in terms of working towards peace in the between North and South Korea. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting presentation. Our final presenter is Mr. Michael Breen. Michael is a Seoul-based journalist and consultant and author of The New Koreans. Michael has lived in Korea for more than 30 years, working first as a journalist for The Guardian, The Times, and The Washington Times, before becoming a public relations consultant in 1994 with the Seoul office of the Burson Marstella PR agency. He founded Inside Communications in 2004, and he's the author of 2 books on Korea, including The Koreans, which was selected as one of the best books on the country by the Financial Times and the Korean Jungan Daily. Michael has graduated with a degree in English literature and linguistics from Edinburgh University. He's a past president of the Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club and an honorary citizen of Seoul. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mr. Michael Breen.
Okay, thank you, Greg, and hello, everybody. Just so that you don't have to stare at me all the time, let me just bring up a presentation here. Oh, sorry, hold on. From the beginning. There we go. So I'm hesitating a little bit. I'm still sort of digesting what Dr. Richardson said. I think these 3 previous presentations are all very fascinating, and we're coming at it from different angles. So I really appreciate that. I think I suppose being based in Seoul, I guess my approach to this is why hasn't it happened, and what needs to be done. I think I guess we're all approaching it in that way. I suppose I hopefully I'll be able to say something a little bit different. You know, peace and reunification seem like a good idea. You know, I won't ask for, among our participants here, I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm sure nobody is sitting there thinking, well, I'm not in favor of this. And I'm sure also if you go out in the streets where you are and ask people who are aware that there are two rival Koreas, they would be in favor. Peace and reunification sounds good to me if that's what they want, you know. In fact, if you keep at it, you probably won't find anybody against. It's a bit like going out on the street and with the puppies are cute campaign. You know, it's like nobody's really against it. But as you know, it's been 70 years and we still don't have peace and reunification. So why is this? Two nice words: peace, reunification. And I know this sounds a bit like an old joke, but I think they represent three problems. So I'll try and explain what I mean by that. The first problem is with the word peace. And those of you of a British heritage will recognize what Winston Churchill is doing there by mistake. There's two versions of peace. What does it mean? I think as John said in his talk, he made the point that peace is more than just the absence of war. But for Karl Marx, the definition of peace was the absence of opposition to socialism. And I think for some conservatives in South Korea, peace probably means the absence of socialism. So to some ears, the word peace sounds like the removal of the other side. So it's a word that, and I'm not getting too philosophical here. What I mean is when the North Koreans hear South Koreans say this word and vice versa, they don't necessarily understand it in the normal sense that we do, or in the UPF sense, certainly. Okay, the next problematic word is reunification. What does that mean? If you go to Korea, if you come here to Seoul and say, I'm an activist overseas for reunification of Korea, the Koreans will smile very nicely and say, thank you for your interest in our country. And then when you've gone, they'll immediately do their due diligence and figure out, okay, are you a right-winger? Are you a liberal? Are you a communist? Where are you coming from? Do you mean reunification in some vague sort of, oh, why can't we just all get along way? Or do you mean something substantial, like a new state with systems? And if so, is this to be done on South Korean terms? Is it to be done on North Korean terms? Or are you suggesting a middle way? And if so, what the hell does that look like? You know? So Koreans will want to know this because they have a stake in this that we don't. Well, I do because I live in Seoul, but you know what I mean. And that stake is not just lifestyle. They will want to make sure that your kind of reunification scenario doesn't end up with them being shot. You know, this is a bit of a life or death thing for people. So here's my problem with this word, reunification. The reason the two Koreas have not reunified is precisely because they're committed to reunification. And they have different interpretations of what that means. For each side, reunification is the umbrella national objective that has driven foreign policy for decades. And we need to recognize that while it may sound nice to us as a word, this notion as it stands today is inherently aggressive. Neither side recognizes the other side. In fact, both claim that the other side belongs to them. And this means that when in this situation, when these two sides talk about reunification and talk about their unification policy, they're talking about a land grab and a people grab. The South Koreans, for example, South Korea claims in its constitution that the North Korean citizens are their citizens. And that's why the South Korea's authorities reject most applications for asylum from refugees, but are legally bound to take escapees from North Korea. Why? Because they're South Korean citizens. In the North, the ruling party charter, its constitution, calls for unification by any means. And that includes, in fact, it implies subversion, collapse, and takeover or war. So reunification of itself is not a moral good, I would say. It needs to be qualified. So the third problem, I think, is when you put the two words together, peace and reunification, then you have a contradiction. We want peace and reunification, but these words are not equals. Which one comes first? This is actually quite a tricky question. If you put reunification first, it means that we are prepared to risk other people's lives to achieve this. This gives reunification the sort of status of liberation. And for North Koreans, that's exactly what it means. The South Koreans have modified their position. Since becoming a democracy, they've committed to reunification by peaceful means. But what if we do it the other way? What if we put peace first? Let's say peace is more important than reunification. Okay, then if UPF wants to take that position, I have an easy solution for you. The best route for peace on the Korean Peninsula is for the two rival states to drop their claim over the other side, to formally recognize one another and give up their national objective of reunification. That removes the threat and lays the ground a potential for peace. Now, I've suggested this to quite a few people in South Korea over the years, and so far, I've not found a single person who agrees with it. So it's a bit of a losing proposition, but there you go. That helps to explain why it hasn't happened. So what needs to be done? I think, or my recommendations for South Korea and the international community, you know, its friends, and for UPF is to do three things. One, accept reality. I'll explain these in more detail, but one, accept reality, frame the reunification given the sort of complexities I've just mentioned, frame the reunification objective in an unambiguous way, and devise the strategic steps that will lead us there. And here's what I mean. The real reason there's no peace between the two Koreas, I mean, I mentioned earlier about reunification, but underlying that, the real reason there is no peace is because these two sides have completely different values. They cannot unify. I'll give you an example, and forgive me if any of this is touching on sensitivities, but why doesn't UPF join forces with the mafia? Why? Because you have different values and different objectives. Could you join forces with the Global Peace Foundation? Possibly, because your underlying values are very, very similar. That there's more like just technical difficulties and personal politics and things like that. But the values, you see what I'm getting at. So we don't often talk about the two Koreas from this point of view. It's much more common to argue about the Korean peace process or the lack of it from a political point of view, either whether you're on the left or the right. And that usually means you can usually tell if someone's coming from a left view or a right view according to who they blame. For example, you may argue that there's no peace between the US and you may argue that there's no peace on the peninsula because the US and South Korea have for decades rejected North Korea's proposal for a Korean War peace treaty. It's surprising that it's the North Koreans who've been pushing this and our side that's been saying no. Or you could come at it from another point of view and argue that peace to the North Koreans means continuing war by another means, and that in that context, a peace treaty will just be followed by pressure for the removal of US troops from South Korea. Now, both of those arguments are true, the left angle and the right angle, but underlying both is the reality of the lack of shared values between these two countries. And this question of values is not as easy as it seems. If you ask a South Korean what her national values are, she will probably tell you what she was taught at school. Something about Confucian filial piety and respect for elders, or some nationalistic thing about the kind of innocence of the Korean race or something. But you can confidently tell her, you can quote me if you like, that she's wrong. She doesn't know her own country's values, because if those were still South Korean values, they used to be, you would see people protesting when locals marry foreigners, for example. Mixed race children would be seen as inferior. And it was like that a generation ago, but now South Korea is a liberal free market democracy that values individual freedom, human rights, the rule of law, fairness, and so on. And when people protest on the streets here, which they do a lot, they do over matters of unfairness and injustice, and precisely those things I just mentioned. The North, on the other hand, pursues a Nazi-like race-based nationalism and a personality cult around the ruling Kim family. And there you will get arrested for marrying a foreigner, and you may even be forced to abort a mixed race child if you're pregnant. So these differences in underlying values fuel the continued separation of these two countries. And it's why that they're both right now, in my opinion, they're still rivals for control. They're not potential partners that need a bit of outside consulting from us to help them realize their joint venture. They're still engaged in a life or death struggle to be the true Korea for 75 million Koreans. So I'm not saying there's no point in peace talks, but I'm just saying we need to accept reality and not fantasize about where we are at right now or where we're likely to be in the near future. What I think needs to be done, point number 2, is to frame the objective in a very clear way, that when we talk about reunification, what are we talking about? In my opinion, our vision, this should be our vision. Our vision should be of a democratic, free market Korean Peninsula based on the rule of law and all those good things, set in the context of a democratic, free market Northeast Asia region. By this, I don't mean that our vision is reunification and that these shared values are the strategy to achieve it. No, I think the shared democratic values should be the vision, and reunification is a likely consequence. So let me restate this to be clear. I'm half Scottish, half English. I don't need these two to be one country in order to feel whole. What I care about is freedom, opportunity, and quality of life. I am sure that the Koreans will reunify eventually, but in a number of scenarios, it's possible to imagine that they may elect to remain separate for quite a long time yet. It could even come down to the political ambitions of their leaders. For example, here's a question for you. What was the name of the leader of East Germany when the two Germanys reunited? I've no idea, and I bet you nobody here has. That's my point. If unified Korea is proposing early retirement for North Korea's leaders, why would they agree to it? Or what if the Northerners have developed more of a durable national identity that is distinct from the South than we really get? And what if they want to go off in a separate direction? Frankly, I don't think, now this seems to be against the theme of our meeting today, but I don't think we should worry about this too much. A nation is a question of identity, and that's a matter for the Koreans. What matters more deeply to us, I believe, is whether the peninsula and the region is democratic or not. I wanted to very quickly, Greg, do I have time? Let's see, what's time? Okay, I'm a bit over time. I'll skip this one. I was going to say something about the difference between the political left and the political right in South Korea, but I think I'll skip it to go on to this. This is what I'd suggest, some elements what I think needs to be done. As I said, I think we need to articulate a vision of a democratic Northeast Asia. What does that mean? Sounds a bit vague and fluffy, but I mean, at the moment, the United States and the Allies have no vision. Their vision is to get rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons. There's no, and even when you mention something like democracy in China, the experts just laugh at you, say, well, that's not going to happen. But I think there needs to be a vision articulated. And once there's a vision, then when there are opportunities to nudge the region in that direction, they'll be recognized and taken. For example, you could develop ideas such as an East Asian version of the Helsinki Agreement. And you can push for agreements on rights and things like that. And some of the things that also that Lauren was talking about, some of these issues, there could be sort of inter-Korean and regional agreements. Why? Because they all fall into into place when we have this overriding vision of a better region. You know? Second, I think we need to adopt a policy of strategic patience. That's what Obama called his policy, but I guess Biden will call it something else. But we need to stop putting nuclear weapons front and center. If we can solve this problem the way we want to, nuclear weapons are going to get taken care of. But just pushing on them is a bit like telling somebody who thinks he's about to be shot to put his weapons down and take the bullet. That's what it's like now. They're not going to do it. So I think it's rather futile. Thirdly, I think we should tone down the conversation about reunification. My apologies to John and all the organizers, but I think we should be talking about reconciliation. This, in my opinion, will be a real first step game changer. If there's going to be non-violent reunification, it's likely to come as the final act of a process of reconciliation. And by that, I mean, you know, the border will still be policed, but we'll be able to travel back and forth. The escapees down here may be able to go back and visit their homes, may even be able to move back if they like. At the moment, there's no freedom like that. And over time, that reconciliation can expand. I think we need to accept reality in that we shouldn't be over expecting, as this current South Korean government has been, we shouldn't be expecting too much from the North Koreans now. They're not ready, basically. That said, I do think a Korean War peace treaty is a good idea. I think, and this is picking up Lauren's themes, we should keep as many talks going in as many forums as we can think of. Why? Because to quote Winston Churchill, to jaw is better than to war. In other words, just lock ourselves down in all these conversations about all sorts of things. And then we develop understanding and so on. And then finally, maybe on the South Korean side, which is what I sort of feel I know best, I think we need some change here to make the prospect of teaming up more palatable. South Korea's democracy, in my opinion, is a kind of model for a reunified Korea. I think when there is reunification, it's going to be like South Korea, a bigger version of South Korea. But the weak link in the democracy system of South Korea is the system of justice. Just consider the last two presidents of this country are in jail. What for? Don't ask me. I think the real crime is being conservative. The corruption charges against them were an afterthought to justify the political revenge. That's my opinion. A lot of people don't agree with that. But the point being, the nastiness of this was made possible by a bendable justice system. So given that, why would anybody in the leadership class in North Korea trust South Korea enough to want to take a step toward unification? knowing that these smiles are fake, and knowing that probably a year later, they're going to get arrested for something. And then finally, I think one thing may surprise you in South Korea, there's no long-term planning for anything except there is a 10-year land use plan. There's no plan in South Korea for anything that lasts more than 5 years, which is the term of the president. And the president is not allowed to serve a second term. I think the South Koreans need to be encouraged to develop long-term planning and thinking. I'll give you an example of this. The previous president came up with an agreement with Japan on the comfort women issue. And funny, ironically, her father in 1965 penned the agreement by the normalization of relations between Japan and South Korea. The current president basically has ripped up these two agreements. Why? Doesn't like them. So again, why would the North Koreans trust us in South Korea if we're like that? Whatever agreement they come to is probably going to get ripped up by the next government. You know, so again, these things all need to be addressed. I think if we're going to encourage the North Koreans to take any steps towards reconciliation, reunification. Thanks very much. Sorry, I went over time. My apologies, but there it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Michael Breen. What a wonderful and well thought out presentation. And we really got the benefit of your 30 years of experience, you know, to really have a reality check as to all the different ingredients and all the different obstacles, I think, to peace building. But all very, very important if we are to achieve our objective of peaceful reunification. Look, actually, our time is now exactly up, like an hour and a half. But if you don't mind, if you just an extra 5 minutes or so, we'll have time to say one question. So I'm going to invite Mr. Randall Apps, the director of UPF in Australia, to select the best question and put it to the panelists. I'm sorry, but our time is over and up, but let's just invite him to select one question for the panel. Thank you, Randall.
Thank you for that. There are questions about the nuclear policy, which the North has, but also there's the question that came early through email, which was about the relationship with China, with a united Korea. And so I'd like to present that one. That says, it would seem that North and South Korea unification would be more smoothly achieved if China were to agree and support this process. How could one see a way for China to recognize that it could also achieve great benefit from doing so peacefully? I'm not sure which of our panelists would like to answer that. Michael seems to have a big smile there.
Okay, let me have a go, and then I'll defer to Lauren and John. How to persuade China? Well, we're not going to. I think I agree and disagree with Reverend Brownbill's point that he feels that the reason the two Koreas haven't unified is because the big players won't allow it. I don't think that's the case. I think the reason they haven't reunified yet is, and that, by the way, that's how Koreans used to view it. They used to think that. But I think now it's become clear that if the Koreans want to reunify, nobody's going to stop them. But then, if there is some kind of reconciliation, and I think this will come with if there's a sort of coup d'état in North Korea, and you have a kind of military dictator that takes over or something like that, starts talking about reconciling with South Korea, then I think China's going to get nervous. I can't see how right now they're manipulating the two sides. I don't see how that works. But if there's a process going to happen, the Chinese will want to be reassured that there aren't going to be American troops on their border. And I think if there's any serious steps towards unification, the South Koreans might ask the Americans to leave, while remaining an American ally might ask those troops to go, knowing the sensitivities. How to persuade China? I think you go in small steps. I think the first step should be, please, China, be nice. We know you're horrible, but try and be nice and stop sending North Korean refugees back to prison camps in North Korea. Please let them get down to Southeast Asia or into Mongolia and to the Korean consulates. You know, that would be a first step.
Lauren or John, would you like to address either of those questions? You can see on the chat area all the questions which were presented.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. Just to, I guess, you know, I'll just start by explaining the way I look at the Korean Peninsula. And I agree with many of Michael's points that reunification is not necessarily the most desirable goal. I look at it as, you know, the Korean Peninsula, it's a peninsula that's been treated very poorly in its neighborhood. You know, it's always been this kind of stomping ground of the great powers. You know, Japan and Russia went to war over it. Japan won, colonized it. And then when Japan was defeated, as a result of that defeat, the United States and the USSR decided to just draw a line through the middle of the country. It was meant to be temporary, and it wasn't temporary. And as a result of that division, that wasn't the Korean Peninsula's own doing, a lot of hostility arose. The Korean War, obviously there's complex reasons for how that war broke out. But it has a lot to do with the fact that the country was divided and occupied by two different foreign countries. So as a result of that, I think all countries in the region have a stake in this. You know, we have a stake in trying to restore peace on the peninsula. And of course, China has many concerns regarding North Korea. And I think it's probably in China's interest that, and also North Korea's interest, that the peninsula stays divided, but that we withdraw the tensions, or reduce the tensions, I should say. And I think one really, it sounds a little bit idealistic, and Michael alluded to this, but it's feasible. I think if, you know, South Korea could make a bargain with North Korea to the effect that we're going to get rid of the US presence, we're going to decouple from the US, remove US bases from the peninsula, and remove the US nuclear umbrella in exchange for you sort of denuclearizing, basically. And China would be very happy with that outcome. I think that would reduce tensions in the region a lot. It does sound idealistic, and I think a first step would be to ending the Korean War and everything like that. The problem is that if you look at all the stakeholders in this issue, China, Japan, the US, South Korea, they all have completely different visions of how, you know, of the sequencing of how peace will be obtained. For the US, it's denuclearize first, everything later. Anything you give North Korea before denuclearization, like if you give them a peace treaty, that's like a reward, and they don't deserve that reward until they denuclearize. China, it's very different. Japan, it's solved the abduction issue first. Everything else comes after that. South Korea, the current government, you know, we need a peace regime first, then we denuclearize. So that's why I think we need a lot of forums, regional forums, a lot of discussion about how we can kind of achieve a consensus for how tensions can be reduced. And from my perspective, as someone who really loves South Korea and has a lot of sympathy for the Korean Peninsula from a historical viewpoint, I just find it very sad that South Koreans have to live on a very hostile peninsula, that South Korean men all have to do military training to match the North Korean capability. This is all very sad, and I think that's what we should be trying to overcome.
Okay. John, before going to you, Michael put his hand up. I'd like to go back to him. Were you wanting to reply to Lauren, Michael?
No, I wondered what that little yellow hand was. I thought somebody was waving at me. No, I didn't. If I did, then it was a mistake.
No
Although
problem.
I do see in the chat, so I think it was when I was opening the chats, I do see that Jacko Zwetsloot is a participant. Jacko actually runs a podcast on North Korea for NK News. He answered my German question by saying Erich Honecker, but I think he was the last big East German leader. I think there was another leader who then asked the West Germans to please take us over. So I might be wrong there, I don't know. Anyway, no, sorry, I didn't have my hand up, sorry.
John, can I get your feeling for us? We are over time, but anyway, quickly
I'll
from
just
you.
be very, very brief. I appreciate our panelists and I appreciate their points of view, and I agree with a lot of the things that were said. And from a UPF perspective, we have an underlying, excuse me, underlying tenet, which is interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. And I do see that that the Korean people are historically the Korean people and have been for thousands of years. And this hiccup has only been for 70 years. And I believe that the reconciliation pathway, the dialogue pathway, is the method necessary for a common universal value system. Because unless everyone is saying apples and apples and not different things, then there won't be. I mean, we know there's different versions of peace, and peace can be used as a weapon, and peace can be used as a pacifier. But reality is, until everyone is on the same page and the systems are more aligned, then this issue of unification of Korea is also tantamount to how do we live in a global world. Historically, nations rose and fell, but we're now in an era where everyone stands their own and there'll be a global community. How does that function? And this here is sort of like a precursor to that. How can we solve this issue of having a common value system first in place, and then from that common value system, it becomes the justice system by which they live by, and then in essence becomes a model nation that other nations can emulate. So how long it'll take, I don't know, but there has to be a move towards getting that universal value. There are things that they can agree on, and you start from there. And I agree, you don't talk about the other things, you just talk about what is necessary to be able to embrace each other. Allow more families to see each other. Allow the travel across the border so people can go to Diamond Mountain and have a holiday there. So that get a tourist trade, because when more people come in and visit North Korea, then the North Koreans can start to feel safe. Oh, these people are okay. So I think by engaging with each other and finding this common ground will be the way to begin the process of finding real peace. All right, thank you.
Okay, so it sounds like invite them over for a barbecue before you cut down the wall. I'll pass it back to Greg. Thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you, Randall, and thank you, everyone. It's now time to conclude this excellent webinar. And I think one thing came clear to me is that the state actors involved, they need help because, they're coming at it from one particular view or another, as Dr. Lauren said. So I think this is where the role of these kind of webinars is very important. UPF is putting together a think tank. It's going to be launched next month, the end of next month. And we're drawing experts from all different fields. Just like this webinar, it is quite diverse. We came from several different angles, Probably there wouldn't be a webinar where you'd have people with different angles like this coming together. But on the issue of the peaceful reunification of North and South Korea, I think we need that. So once again, thank you, congratulations to our panelists for their very enlightening presentations. We've all been very enriched by what you've said to us today. Thank you also for the interest of our viewers. Thank you for your questions and for your support. Thank you to the technical staff behind the scenes who've made this webinar possible. So we invite you all to look out for future UPF webinars, which will further develop the theme of the peaceful reunification of the North and South Korea, as well as other stimulating content related to meeting the challenges and concerns of our times. So thank you again, and please have a very enjoyable remaining weekend. God bless you all. Thank you.